We are on the module for fiscal policy, first learning objective, and it's a short one too. Compare monetary and fiscal policy. Okay, distinguishing between fiscal and monetary is really easy. It's based on who carries it out. Fiscal policy is anything the government does that is related to the economy. Monetary policy is anything central banks do, and pretty much everything the central bank does is related to the economy or to the banking sector. So we'll start with monetary here. Activities related to the levels of money supply and credit, and how credit is managed is typically through the interest rate. If you raise interest rate, you make credit more expensive. You also make banks a little bit more cautious about lending, because the ability to service debt at a higher interest rate becomes a little bit more difficult. So they become a little bit more picky. So you pull back the amount of credit. When you pull back the amount of credit, you actually pull back the growth in the money supply. Some countries will use reserve requirements to control the level of credit, but that's typically in developing economies or emerging economies. They'll tend to use the reserve requirement more often. In developed economies, they tend to rely on the interest rate more often to control credit. Central banks typically act independently of government. For fiscal, related to the economy, you have two broad tools: taxation and spending. Both the fiscal and the monetary are used to regulate or influence economic activity over time, to either accelerate economic activity or to slow down the economy when there are signs that the economy is overheating, like overinvestment in a particular sector that is creating what appears to be a financial bubble, or a level of inflation that is becoming uncomfortable for the central bank to want to live with. The goal of both is to create an economic environment where growth is stable and positive, and inflation is low and stable. The first one is typically referred to as full employment, the full employment mandate, and the second one is typically referred to as the price stability mandate. Some central banks only have one mandate, which is price stability. Some have two, which is price stability and full employment. As far as the government is concerned, it really does have both. It wants to ensure job creation, but also wants to ensure that its citizens can actually afford to live in that particular country, or that they are paying for housing, they're paying for food, they're living a good middle-class life. Attempt to avoid boom and bust scenarios. You may be thinking, well, they're not very good at that, are they? Because we still have them. We do. But what we don't have is a counterfactual. And the counterfactual is an observation of what we would have in the absence of anything. So let's assume there was no fiscal or monetary policy to regulate the economy in any way whatsoever. What would be the occurrences of boom and bust scenarios? We don't have that. And we're not going to find out by saying, hey, let's do an experiment. Let's find out. So we really don't know if there would be more, or if the economy is self-regulating. There are theorists on both sides saying, hey, listen, if you have very little government intervention, the economy self-regulates and regulates faster. And there are others saying no, like John Nash from A Beautiful Mind. You remember the movie? He said an economy can get stuck in a suboptimal equilibrium and stay there, which means you would need some kind of policy to push it out of that suboptimal equilibrium. So even though we are seeing boom and bust scenarios, we can't write off intervention in the economy either through fiscal or monetary policy, because we don't have a good counterfactual. We care about fiscal policy because governments are large employers. And because they're large employers, they can influence the level of employment within a country. They are a large component of aggregate demand through their spending and through their taxation. If they cut taxes, they leave more spending power in the hands of consumers, and given a high marginal propensity to consume, consumers will then spend that money. So a government can spend money, or it can cut taxes and leave the money in the hands of people who will spend money, which is probably more market determined in terms of what is supplied and what is demanded. They are the largest bond issuer in terms of the amount of debt that they issue. And they also engage in policy to redistribute wealth and income. That is primarily through taxation, taking it from certain areas and then redistributing it to others, which happens through their spending. Next learning objective, comes in two parts. First part, describe roles and objectives of fiscal policy. The next part is to look at arguments as to whether the size of a national debt relative to GDP matters. And given the increased size of debt to GDP ratios in most developed countries, well, that's an interesting argument these days. Okay, let's look at the effect of fiscal policy on aggregate demand from both taxation and spending. Taxation will affect the level of disposable income. We know that consumers have a high marginal propensity to consume, so the more money you leave them with, the more they'll spend it. The more you extract from people in terms of taxation, the less money they have to spend. Consumption through a sales tax. Increasing a sales tax decreases the amount that I can buy because so much of my money now has to go towards that sales tax. So you can actually decrease the amount or increase the amount of consumption through a sales tax. CapEx. This is business investment. This is the government spending money to build out some kind of infrastructure, like a port or a rail terminal or a new airport, which increases the productive capacity of the economy, which can affect aggregate demand. Most directly when they are building out CapEx, well, they're spending money, right? You need all the material and all the labor to build that airport, to build that rail port, so that will add to employment. And employment, go back up here, creates disposable incomes, which add to aggregate demand. Spending, when they do spend, it does create employment because when they spend $1 and it goes somewhere else, well, somebody has to hire somebody to satisfy that contract, creates employment. And consumption. If you're going to buy into fiscal policy as a tool for helping to engineer an economy, you really have to approach it from a Keynesian perspective. And we'll contrast Keynesians with monetarists here. Fiscal policy can have a significant effect on aggregate demand, output, and employment. And this is the important part. When there is an output gap meaning the economy is operating below its potential, then the government has a role to play in filling the gap between where it is and the potential. If an economy is operating at its potential, all government intervention will do at that point, especially on the spending side, is push the economy beyond its potential and create inflation. So Keynesians advocate for this. In recessions, governments should increase their spending, reduce their taxes. This will help raise employment and output. During this period of time, government revenues will be less than government expenses. The government will be running a budget deficit, so they should issue debt to finance the deficit. In expansions, they should then lower their spending and raise taxes, because over here you lower taxes, here you would bring them back up. Your revenues will exceed your expenses. That is a budget surplus. Use that to pay down the debt you issued over here when you had a deficit. However, governments today in recessions do run budget deficits and they issue debt. And in expansions, they run budget deficits and they issue debt. They haven't got the message that, hey, you're supposed to come down to this line over here. Somebody needs to tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, Keynes wants to have a word with you, man. A surplus is contractionary. The reason is if you have a surplus, that means the government is taking money out of the economy and is not recirculating that money back into the economy because it has a big surplus. A deficit is expansionary because it is adding money into the economy that it did not extract out of the economy. Monetarists say, don't even bother with this. Any fiscal changes that you do will only have a temporary effect on aggregate demand. They'll have no long-lasting effect. There is a significant amount of fiscal policy that is in place that automatically increases the amount or decreases the amount of spending depending on what is going on in the economy. These are called automatic stabilizers or non-discretionary policy. A good example of that are transfer payments. So in an economic slowdown, transfer payments increase, revenue decreases. So the big transfer payment there is unemployment. Unemployment payments will increase, and since that person lost the job, the income tax from that person is no longer available, revenue decreases. In expansions, well, transfer payments drop because more people get jobs, and if they get jobs, they're paying income tax, revenue increases. So these automatic stabilizers reduce output fluctuations. That's why they're called stabilizers. Some terminology here. Debt, this is the accumulation of all deficits. If a government from its inception ran balanced budgets all the time where the revenue it collected equaled what it spent, it would have no need for debt. It would issue no debt. So debt is the sum total of all unpaid deficits, and a government will finance its debt by issuing bonds. Big holders of government bonds, banks, insurance companies, pension funds. Ratio, debt to GDP. Notice we're talking about nominal GDP here. And a way to keep this straight is debt is in dollars, or in whatever currency it is. It is a nominal number. If you owe $1,000, you owe $1,000. It's not a real number, it's a nominal number, so you must divide by a nominal number as well. If the denominator grows, which is nominal GDP, if you have a constant percentage of revenue to GDP, such that your weighted tax take of all GDP and economy, let's say, is 20%, and you can grow nominal GDP, your revenue increases. If your revenue increases, it improves your second ratio, which is your interest payments to nominal GDP. This measures your servicing ability. If real GDP growth is less than the real interest rate. So what we're doing is we're taking inflation out of both sides. We're not going to pay attention to that. Real GDP less than the real interest rate. The ratio of debt to GDP will worsen. So there is a relationship to watch between GDP and the real interest rate. It worsens since if you take the real interest rate times the amount of debt, this amount will grow faster than what real GDP will be growing by. And if you're using debt to finance or to roll over your debt, which governments typically do, the amount of debt will grow faster than GDP. However, there is something nice about inflation. Inflation has some bad things to it, but nothing is completely good or completely bad. Everything has advantages and disadvantages. When a disadvantage shows up, it would be a crime not to take advantage of its advantages, right? That is finding opportunity in crisis. If you have higher inflation, you will get higher nominal GDP because nominal GDP is real GDP plus inflation. But your debt will not increase at the rate of inflation. So debt does not inflate. So if you allow inflation to run high for a period of time, you can improve the debt to GDP ratio. That is called deflating your debt. So the debt to GDP ratio gets better. However, it worsens with deflation, which is a big reason why governments with a lot of debt do not want inflation. Look at Japan and how hard it is fought to make sure that deflation doesn't happen. The negative interest rates, the low level of yields pretty much across the curve, the amount of quantitative easing that they've engaged in, the amount of money printing that they've engaged in just to avoid having any deflation. Because if they have deflation, that debt to GDP ratio, which they have is over 200%, would get really bad really fast. So they need inflation, and with inflation they can improve their debt to GDP ratio because they are now deflating their debt. Is that what lies in store for some of the more developed countries like Canada and the US that have GDP ratios, debt to GDP ratios exceeding 100% now? So a discussion of whether or not we should be concerned with the level of debt to GDP. On the no side, not really, not if it's owed internally. This is the issue in Japan. Most of that government debt is owed to its own citizens, and since the government has taxing authority, well, it's not that big a deal. If debt was used for CapEx, well, it will increase the productive capacity of the economy so that it improves future growth. It may require tax changes that may correct existing distortions. So if there was a very low level of debt, and let's say there were distortions in the economy that a better tax code could help, well, why do we need to raise taxes? We don't owe a lot of money. But if you owe a lot of money, suddenly you got to start thinking about things. A good example of one here is the alternative minimum tax, AMT, on corporations of 15%. If they have incomes taxable income greater than $1 billion. So what it says here is that You may have legitimate deductions, such as for depreciation and amortization, etc. You may have legitimate deductions off your billion that might get you down to a 9% tax. And what they're saying is here, you can use your legitimate deductions to get down to 15%. That is the minimum tax. Any other deductions that could have gotten you lower, you can defer to the next year. And you can keep deferring them to the next year, but each year, if you're over $1 billion, you must pay at least 15%. That is a tax policy that came into place as a result of all of this thinking about, listen, we do have spending requirements, but we got debt, so we got to do something here. And so they get creative in the way that they would tax different entities, such that, you can't argue that this is unfair. It's like, okay, well, you're not saying, oh, you can't have these deductions anymore, or that, oh, well, if you have over $1 billion, you don't get these deductions, but the person beside you get the deductions. All they're saying is, look, let's cut you off at 15 and just carry them over for the next day. I think that's fair. There's an argument that there is no net impact of debt, and this is based on the Ricardian equivalence, which I think is nice in theory, nice in math, but if we took an Aristotelian view of the world and described people as they are, this simply doesn't work. This is saying that a government that engages in higher spending today will produce higher taxes tomorrow, and the citizens will anticipate that, well, if you're spending this much today, you're only going to raise taxes on me in the future, hence I will save more today. And because of that, the spending will not have the effect that it wants, such that a government would argue that there's no point in spending, because if we spend, the consumers will just save what we spend and will have no impact, hence why get into debt in the first place. Well, that can't possibly be an argument not to be concerned about your debt when you have debt, because this is saying that you shouldn't have debt because you would anticipate that it wouldn't have any effect. So kind of circular logic on that. If an output gap exists, debt is not competing with more productive use of savings. And we will talk about crowding out when we get down here. There would be no crowding out effect up here. Let's look at why we should be concerned about debt. Higher levels of debt, well, it's got to be paid for by somebody. Keep in mind that every single penny a government spends has got to come from someone, and since a government can't tax another country's citizens directly, they got to get it from you. They got to get it from you, so it's going to be higher tax rates, which may lead to disincentives to economic activity. And a little later in this video, we'll look at something called the Laffer curve, L-A-F-F-E-R, not a laughter curve, a Laffer curve named after an economist. Loss of confidence in the government. The central bank will have to print money, and that will be inflationary. Or it may crowd out private investment, because there is this identity that savings equal investment. So let's say that we had, to understand that, let's say that we had four entities in an economy, and every entity spent exactly what they made. But this person wants to spend more. Well, where are they going to get it from? Everyone's spending what they make. You would have to have some savings over here from all of these people. And then if this person wants to invest in, let's say, build a house, which is an asset, which adds to the wealth of a nation, because you're building real assets now, would then use these savings to add to this investment. No savings, no investment. So we have this identity, savings equal investment. If the government is taking more of the S, there is less private I, or private investment. Next up, keyword here, describe tools of fiscal policy and their advantages and disadvantages. All right, let's look at these in terms of outflows and in terms of inflows. For outflows, transfer payments. We talked about these when we looked at automatic stabilizers. I am putting the letter B in brackets here because we're going to see transfer payments included in a mathematical sentence, not a mathematical sentence, an algebraic sentence. So we should know what B is. A transfer payment is B. Things like welfare, pensions, specific government pensions. Most pensions you pay into, some you don't have to, some you automatically get. So Canada has two of these. One is called an old age pension that you would get when you hit a certain age, and another one is called the guaranteed income supplement, which is just a transfer payment. You didn't pay into those programs. Housing benefits, tax credits, child benefits, unemployment. These are not included in GDP because it's not considered spending by G. So when the government issues transfer payments, that is not, remember, GDP is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Transfer payments are not considered part of G. They show up over here under C. So they're not included in GDP in the G component. They show up in the C component. Spending, health, education, defense, all the things that you would expect a government would spend money on. Justified on both economic and social grounds. And CapEx. There are some things that private industry will not build that you really have to rely on governments to build, like highways connecting two cities. So this is called CapEx, or infrastructure, roads, ports, schools. This affects the productive potential of an economy. And if a government is making investments in the economy to improve the productive potential, and a company wants to set up business in that country, I think country is fair to point out that, oh, now you're setting up business in a country that gives you a lot of productive potential right away. That's why our tax rates are where they are, because we've already done all this for you. Imagine if there were no roads between these two cities. You would have to bear the burden of shipping that product yourself, but because there's a nice road and we plow these roads, it's easier for you, so come on, pay up. Inflows, direct taxes and indirect taxes. Direct taxes, income, wealth, and corporate profits. Income tax on your wages, on capital gains, interest, and dividends. Wealth tax on estate and property. Your property is your property tax. You pay that. And corporate profits. Indirect taxes, duties, fuel, alcohol, tobacco. Sometimes there are indirect taxes on some of these that are higher than they should be, specifically because the government wants to reduce the consumption of that, not necessarily because it wants to raise revenue. So in Canada, for instance, there are lots, very large taxes on alcohol and very large taxes on tobacco, especially on tobacco, because the government would like to see that go away. It's not there to raise revenue, although it does. So that raises the interesting question, if everybody quit smoking, where would the government get its revenue from? It would have to try to replace it from something else. Sales taxes and lotteries. Most people don't consider lotteries a form of tax, but a private company cannot start a lottery. The government or the state, the province, whatever, has a monopoly on lotteries. And lotteries are usually funded by the lower incomes of society. They tend to predominantly spend more money on lotteries than any other place. And the money that's given out as prizes is not the total money that is received, so it is a form of taxation, an indirect tax. Inflation helps both of these. With inflation, you have wage inflation. With wage inflation, your incomes go up. So if you're paying 30% of your income in tax and you make more income, you pay, that 30% ends up being a bigger number. So a government can always increase its revenue through inflation and increase its tax revenue without increasing its tax rates. Taxation is justified for both revenue and income and wealth redistribution purposes. This is fairly straightforward. I don't think you'd get much disagreement over the statement that the existence of a government creates an expense. And that if you are in a country, you have the protection of the social contract. Well, that requires some consideration. I don't think you get much issue out of that. The more contentious issue that divides a lot of people is the level of income and wealth redistribution. You have some people who say there should be no redistribution whatsoever. Any redistribution is tantamount to confiscation. You have a bigger group in the middle that says, well, yes, there should be some redistribution, because if there isn't, there are going to be some negative consequences we don't want to see. And then you have people way at the other side that said, no, above some level, there should be massive redistribution. And, well, I don't know that anybody will ever meet on all of those. Desirable attributes of a tax policy. Well, the first one doesn't need any exposition on that. It should be simple. I mean, if you can't understand the tax policy, it can then begin to become subjective and open to a lot of interpretation from the taxing authorities. It should be simple rules. It should be efficient. And by efficient, we mean it should not deter any kind of activity. Taxes should interfere as little as possible in your choices. Should discourage work and investment as little as possible. So let's give you an example of where taxes are somewhat inefficient. In Canada, there is something called the luxury tax, that if you buy a vehicle that is more than $100,000, not only is there a 13% tax on the purchase that you pay, but any amount over $100,000 hits another 20% tax. Well, there are some vehicles now that are $110,000, $120,000 that are not really luxury vehicles. The price of vehicles are going up. So that if you're buying a $110,000 car, you might say, well, I'm not going to buy that. I've got to buy something under 100 because now I'm going to pay another 20% on that difference. So it will deter some activity over that 100,000. Or it will be, the car will then be packaged differently as a car and then as a package of services to go on top of the car. There'll be some change in behavior associated with that. Should discourage work and investment as little as possible. This is often broken. There are times where a government will use taxes to be specifically inefficient. In other words, it wants to interfere as much as possible in the decision. Alcohol, tobacco. There are some states in the U.S. where alcohol is very expensive, and there are some states in the U.S. where alcohol is really cheap. Florida is a good example where alcohol is really cheap. Canada, the price of, let's say, a bottle of vodka is about 4 times as much what you would pay in Florida, specifically because of the taxes. Tobacco, hugely expensive, and Canada has legalized marijuana now. Huge tax grab in that one. Tax system should be fair. I don't think anyone would disagree with horizontal equity. People in similar situations should pay the same tax. Or, said another way, people in similar situations should have the same tax laws, tax deductions as well, available to them. Vertical equity. Again, this is all part of this income and wealth redistribution argument. Those who earn more should pay more. And that is considered fair, where some people would say, well, no, that is not fairness at that point. And again, there's a spectrum of people who would agree or disagree with that. Revenue sufficiency. Now, this is saying that the tax that you collect should be sufficient to run the government. And then whatever policies you have after that, your revenue should be sufficient for that. Well, this is probably going to conflict with other attributes depending on the ideology of the government that is running the show. If you have a government that leans more towards massive redistribution, huge social programs, you will, for quite a few people, breach the fairness attribute. Issues with taxes and the level of taxes may reduce incentives to work and save, including flight. California is already seeing this. And I'm in a province in Canada in which my total tax rate is 53.5%. And there is some talk with the new budget coming out later on. I'm doing this in March. We usually get the budget near the end of the March. There is some talk that this top tax rate will go to 56%. And if it does, I'm telling you right now, because I have an American PhD, I will begin the process of leaving this country. Because we are now moving away from vertical equity and breaching the fairness. That I don't see that as being equity. I no longer see that as being fair. I don't even think 53.5 is fair, but okay, I'll do it. If you keep coming back to successful people saying we need to take more, then you're going to get flight. And listen, I wouldn't be the only person that is on the edge of making that decision. Fairness. This is subjective. When we talk about the attribute of fairness, it depends on your position. You know the old expression, freedom fighter or terrorist, depends on which side of the gun you're standing on. Well, this also depends on your position. Most morality comes from positions of deficits, so that it is immoral for someone to have so much food while others have no food. However, from the other perspective, if I arrived at my food under my own efforts, it is immoral for a group of people to show up and take my food. So fairness really is subjective, and it depends on your position. Let's look at the Laffer curve here. If we plot tax revenue, the amount of tax revenue a government can collect, along with the tax rate, what our economist here was saying is that government revenues will increase as tax rates increase up to a certain point. After a certain point, it will be deemed from a group of people, more and more people as you keep raising tax rate, that it's becoming unfair. It's deterring my investment. It's deterring work, including capital flight, leaving a country, leaving a province, leaving a state, and then actually the higher you go, revenues will actually begin to decline. Well, that is not very efficient at some point. So once you pass fairness, efficiency starts to drop off significantly, and then revenue sufficiency starts to drop off significantly as well. Tax reform versus spending reform. So that if you are thinking, well, we don't have enough money, we're running deficits, we need to raise taxes. And if you have nothing reining in that side where you're always running to taxes and taxes, then you're missing the idea of, hang on a second, maybe we don't have a revenue problem, maybe we've got a spending problem, so that we need some kind of spending reform instead of tax reform. Okay, a couple of points here on the advantages and disadvantages of using fiscal policy to actually engineer outcomes in the economy. The advantage is that some policies can be adjusted very quickly. What do you think a disadvantage is? Some others can't, right? Some are inflexible in the short run, such as direct taxes, some forms of spending which need congressional approval, and entitlements. Therefore, it is not very effective in suppressing the effects of a recession. That would be sort of the con argument against using fiscal policy as well. Listen, by the time you implement it and get it ready to go, it's not going to work out very well. We're going to revisit that thought a little later on at the end of the video. Let's move on to the fiscal multiplier. To understand the multiplier, let's put two algebraic statements up. The first one is the budget deficit. Spending minus revenue plus transfer payments equal the budget deficit. To see that that works out, imagine that spending was 120, revenue was 100, and 10 were transfer payments. So we have 120 minus 100 plus 10 is 30. You'd have a budget deficit of 30. If we reverse that, just so that you can see what happens when we have a negative sign, let's imagine that spending was 100, revenue was 120, and transfer payments were 10. You'd have negative 10. Well, a negative deficit is a surplus, right? The next one, YD. Y means disposable income. So our disposable income is equal to Y minus NT, which is national income or output. We have that identity that aggregate income equals aggregate expenditure equals aggregate output. That's an identity from macroeconomics. So Y being output is also income. So disposable income is equal to our total income minus our net taxes. And this is taxes less transfer payments. So if we pay out 50 in tax, but 10 is sent back in transfer payments to different people, then net taxes are 40 from the aggregate of income. Now the way to write it is 1 minus T times Y. T is the tax rate, the effective overall tax rate that represents net revenues for the government. 1 minus T times Y. Let's deal with the fiscal multiplier. What we're doing with the fiscal multiplier is it's a way to measure how much output would change for a change in either taxation or spending. Okay, let's see if we can conceive of this visually, what is going on when a government spends $1 and how we can come up with the statement that, well, if government spends $1, it ends up being $3.50 on GDP. One thing that is not introduced in this section is the amount of time. such as in a given year, that if a government spent $1 today, over the next year, how much would it contribute to GDP? When we say there's a multiplier, that is until it reaches the end. In other words, it limits out at, if you spend $1 and let's say it's $3.50, the multiplier is 3.5, it limits out at $3.50 for every dollar, but that may be over 27 months. To get the amount by which it would increase GDP per year, you would need to know the velocity of money per year. This doesn't get involved in that. It just talks about what it limits out to. So here is the government over here, and the government is going to spend some money, and here is person 1, person 2, person 3, and let's say it spends $1. What does person 1 get? Well, the government is going to charge tax. The person 1 has some money after tax and has a certain marginal propensity to consume and a certain marginal propensity to save. What they consume will go to person 2 because my spending is somebody else's income. Of course, the government will tax their income and they'll have a marginal propensity to consume and to save. And when they spend, well, that's somebody else's revenue. And of course, you pay tax on your income. And this person has a marginal propensity to consume, a marginal propensity to save, etc., etc., etc. This limits out to 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume in a taxless system. Once you introduce tax, you just stick the tax in front of the marginal propensity to consume. Notice the tax comes before the marginal propensity to consume, so it's 1 minus t times the marginal propensity to consume. So if you remember this, in the face of taxes, you just put 1 minus t in front of MPC, and that is with tax. That is called the fiscal multiplier. So I give you an example over here. Let's say the government spends $1 and everybody's marginal propensity to consume is 0.9 and it's a 20% tax rate. So this dollar, by the time it gets to person 1, is only 80 cents because it's a 20% tax rate. With a marginal propensity to consume of 0.9, this person will spend 72 cents and save 8 cents. Well, this 72 cents goes to the next person. It has to be taxed at 20%. So notice this dollar here is taxed at 20% and multiplied by 0.9. This 72 cents is taxed at 20% multiplied by 0.9, taxed at 20% multiplied by 0.9. This over here is just this. In other words, that is 72 cents here, and it's taxed again. 51.84, and on and on and on it goes. Notice that these string together. And in the limit, this is what you get over here. Let's do an example just to show you what happens when we change taxes. What's the effect of raising taxes? So let's say the current tax rate is 20%, marginal propensity to consume is 0.9. If the government spends $1 as part of its fiscal policy, what is the multiplier effect of that in the limit? 1 over 1 minus, 20% is the tax rate, 1 minus t times marginal propensity to consume, $3.57.1 cents, $3.57 let's say. So the government knows, well, if we spend $1 today, it'll multiply to 3.57. By the way, if you multiply all of that by 0.2, you'll see that the government recovers quite a bit of what it spends in extra taxes. Let's raise the tax rate to 22%. Then our denominator goes from 0.28 to 0.298, 3.356. Notice that if you raise the tax rate from 20 to 22%, the multiplier drops 21 cents for every dollar in spending. You actually create less GDP, less future output by raising taxes now. So you can lower taxes to increase the multiplier, and since money is taxed each time it hits the next person, you have more opportunities to tax, or you can raise tax now and collect the tax, but your multiplier would be lower, so the total sum of all the taxable incomes would be lower going into the future. If we write out our formula here, this over here is C. C is our marginal propensity to consume, and we just think about total income now. There's our disposable income. There's the marginal propensity to spend. Our disposable income is equal to our marginal propensity to consume, y minus nt, which we saw on the previous screen, and we know we can write it this way. This is our marginal propensity to consume in the presence of taxes. Okay, we will end with something called the balanced budget multiplier. When I say end, it's this learning objective. And this causes students some grief. And I'm sure if you had been through it, you probably thought, but this makes no sense. There is no way that you can go from a balanced budget to increased output. How could that possibly be? There is a couple of assumptions that are made here. A big assumption is made that if you don't make that assumption, the model breaks down completely. But in making the assumption, you have to ask, but how did the assumption come to be? I'll show you. And this is saying that if government spending increases by $1, and tax revenue also increases by $1. In other words, you're going to run a balanced budget. The government decides we want to spend $1 more, so it decides to raise taxes somewhere and come up with $1 more. That spending increases. Total spending in the economy increases, which seems counterintuitive because you would think, well, wait a minute. If you take $1 from someone else, they're not going to spend it. And if the government spends the dollar, isn't that the same thing? How can spending possibly increase? And you have to make an assumption about the investment or the savings quantity in the economy. So let's assume that we have a marginal propensity to consume of 0.9 at the macro level. Given your population, the way they spend, there's a marginal propensity to consume of 0.9. And we're going to assume that GDP is currently at 1,000, made up of 900 of consumption, because that's the marginal propensity to consume, and investment spending of 100, because remember, our identity, savings equal investment. So the components of GDP are C plus I plus G plus X minus M, and we're really only concerned about the household and business sector right now. Once we introduce taxes, we'll introduce a government component, and we'll leave the international component out of it right now. So for these two to hit 1,000, you have consumption of 900, investment of 100, but that investment must come from savings. If you have a marginal propensity to consume of 0.9, savings must have equaled the 100. However, this is where it runs off the rails just to make the math work and to make the point that, yeah, magically spending would increase. Is you have to make the assumption that this $100 investment is fixed and is not related to income, such that if incomes go up or incomes go down, this 100 would stay the same. It is independent of income. It is fixed. That is not defensible, unfortunately. But you have to make that assumption to get spending to go up. Well, if your assumption is not defensible, how can your output or your outcome of this be defensible? Yet, here we are. This is one of those things where we say it's an idea so crazy, only an academic could hold it. So let's put a tax rate of 20% on there. Our GDP will rise to 1,080. Let me show you how you get there. Consumption is now 720 because we had 1,000 over here. That was what we had. The consumption level here was 900. That is your marginal propensity to consume. But now we're going to introduce a tax rate. So instead of getting the 1,000, you're only going to get 800. And if you multiply 800 by 0.9, that is where you get your marginal propensity to consume. But you have $80 in savings, which adds to investment because savings equal investment, and the government's going to spend 200, thus coming up with 1,080. That only works if you say that this over here is independent of national incomes. In other words, it's fixed, it's not related to income. The question then would be, well, then where does the investment come from if not from savings from income? See what I'm getting at? So notice what total spending is here, 720 and 200. Spending is now 920 instead of 900, and GDP is higher. So the rationale here is that if we take more money from consumers and we spend it, but we balance the budget, we can actually increase output, because this level of investment would go on without the need for consumer savings. It just doesn't work in the real world, but it is just a theoretical model to think about what a balanced budget could potentially do if in fact investment could come from outside the model. Next up, explain the implementation of fiscal policy and difficulties of implementation, as well as whether a fiscal policy is expansionary or contractionary. So we have said earlier that a fiscal deficit is expansionary because that means government spending exceeds the amount they pulled out of the economy to finance it, and government surpluses or fiscal surpluses are contractionary because it's pulling more money out of the economy than it's putting back in. So we can simply look at the two and say, well, if you have a deficit, that's expansionary fiscal policy. If you have a surplus, that is contractionary fiscal policy. But that ignores the automatic stabilizers that exist in an economy. So that because an economy fluctuates from growth to recession, these automatic stabilizers could on their own create deficits and surpluses that are independent of policy. So describe that deficit as a fiscal, either the deficit or surplus is either being expansionary or contractionary. We first must determine, well, wait a minute now, maybe it's neutral and those are just the stabilizers that are doing it. What is the difference between a deficit and a structural deficit? So we have to introduce the term structural deficit and surplus. What would exist if the economy was at full employment or full potential output? Then we would determine what the structural deficit or surplus is. Hopefully, if you're at full employment or potential output, there is no need to run deficits. You're probably, hopefully, running a budget or a neutral budget, which means a balanced budget. Recall we introduced the term automatic stabilizers. They'll affect the deficit or surplus unrelated to fiscal policy. So what may then appear to be expansionary or contractionary, based on what automatic stabilizers would create, may only be the result of non-discretionary reactions. So it would be inappropriate to look at a budget deficit and say, the fiscal stance of policy is expansionary. There may be no policies in place that are discretionary, that are expansionary, and the deficit is purely a result of the automatic stabilizer. So we would not describe that as being expansionary fiscal policy. It would just be the result of non-discretionary policies. Therefore, the level of surplus or deficit may not be a good indicator of the fiscal policy stance. Okay, there's a lot going on here. I've tried to draw it out on two timelines so you can see what is going on. On the first timeline here, we have a problem in the economy that originates over here. But it takes time to recognize a problem. It takes time for it to show up in the economic data, so it is detected over here. But once you detect the problem, by the time you decide to do something about it and draw up plans and start putting them into action, maybe your plans get implemented over here. Once they get implemented, well, it takes time to have its effect on the economy. It has its effect over here. So the time from problem origination to problem detection is called a recognition lag. The time from detection to when action is decided upon, and all action is decided upon under conditions of uncertainty, from the time that you decide that you have to do something to the time you implement it is called the action lag, and from implementation to its effect is called the impact lag. This is G. Down here we have C plus I. We have our households and our businesses, other units. Well, they're going to see that there is a problem as well. Maybe they recognize it sooner than the government recognizes, and they start changing behavior. Well, once they start changing behavior, it may have an effect somewhere down here. When the government announces that, okay, we're going to do something, something is announced, well, this announcement will also change behavior and have some effect here. So that by the time we see the effect of government action, we already have had the effect of households and business action and the added effect based on the announcement that this may not have the intended effect anymore, or it may overdo the effect that they actually wanted to put into place. Usually, when action is announced, it is either going to target employment or target inflation. If it targets employment and you're at near full employment, or there's a tight labor market, you may actually end up accelerating inflation. If you have policies that are meant to target inflation, it may actually increase unemployment. Keep in mind now, if you have inflation and the problem is detected, these units have already detected it as well. They may start changing behavior, which lowers inflation. They may take action, which also lowers inflation. The combination of all of those together would be to increase unemployment, because if I cut back on my spending, well, my spending is somebody else's income. If they get less income, they don't need as many employees, and on and on. Whatever the government is doing is going to require some forms of debt. That may be difficult if debt levels are already elevated. Plus, you may get a crowding out effect, because when a government issues debt, since S equals I, savings equal investment, if the government is competing for some of this S, there is less of this I for private investment. So it competes for savings for private investment. And anything they announce is really intended to target aggregate demand. If they are trying to raise aggregate demand, this is only useful if spare capacity exists. And it also has to do with the labor market, which is the issue. If we're looking at 2023, this is the issue in the market at that time. If spare capacity exists, in other words, factory utilization, capacity utilization is running 75 to 80%, lots of capacity, but there is a labor shortage, spending will not increase aggregate demand, but will only increase inflation. If you go back to the 2022 to 2023 period, that is exactly what happened. And that brings us to the end of this.